Okay, so next up we have Arunas Radzvilavicius. Let me, Arunas right here. I'm gonna pin him. And I'm gonna pin myself, of course. Okay, hello Arunas, thank you so much for the patience to join us. We are very excited to have you. And Arunas has offered an amazing opportunity to review some of your writing. So again, I will repeat that in the Slack there is a Google Drive, or you can drop your 300-word abstract or idea, and then Arunas has kindly agreed to review them. But let's first introduce Arunas. So Arunas has an interdisciplinary background in mathematical modeling and computational approaches to genetics, psychology, economics, and evolution. He's currently a Nature editor and an editor in the Nature Human Behavior Journal. But before that, he worked for 6 different research groups around the world, including a postdoctoral position at the University of Pennsylvania, University of Sydney, and University of Zurich. So without further ado, let's welcome Arunas. And Arunas, we're looking forward to your talk.
Thanks a lot for the introduction, Daniel. Can you all hear me all right?
Yes. Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, and just to confirm, you can see my screen as well.
I can see your screen, yes.
Wonderful. It's really good to be here. Thank you, Daniel, for inviting me. I'm a big fan of your summer school and just everything that you're doing with it. So it's a privilege to be here and share some tips and tricks and more information about academic publishing and academic science writing in general. So this is going to be a slightly different talk. I'm not going to talk about research at all. There's not going to be any results. I will talk more about what you're doing with your research after your paper is finished. So where you submit it, how you submit it, what happens to the paper after you submit it, and also what it means to write about science effectively. So that includes both writing academic papers and also writing perhaps articles intended for more general audiences. So let me advance this first. So as Daniel said, I am an editor and I work at a journal called Nature Human Behavior. So it's one of many Nature branded journals, all of them sort of under the same umbrella of Nature research. And in general, in the world of publishing, there are many different types of editors. There are editors who sort of correct people's typos. There are editors who help authors write books. And I am the type of editor who helps people publish their science and helps them sort of shape their publications in a way that is going to end up being more impactful than perhaps their initial draft. And so most of the time I spend on manuscripts that you as authors submit to us. So I'm sort of evaluating the type of advance that the manuscript makes in the world of science and whether we as a journal at a specific level within the journal hierarchy is the best outlet for that type of paper. But that's only one sort of smaller part of what we do. A lot of our work is actually related to maintaining good relationships with the members of a community, all sorts of speaking engagements. We also we don't always wait for papers to come to us. We also go to conferences and to preprint servers and look for promising papers and then invite them to us. We also communicate with press, write press releases. We write editorials on things that we think and the community thinks are important for them, both in terms of scientific value and sort of more broad societal issues. So this is a very sort of rough sketch of what happens to a paper after submission once it lands on my desk. So as an editor, I'm involved in sort of all of these different steps, including a first read, and I read every single paper that that is submitted to us. That falls like under my expertise areas. And then we make initial decisions in terms of whether the paper kind of fits the scope of our journal, or whether it's better to suggest that the authors submit that paper somewhere else. Then we also coordinate and handle peer review. So we find people in the field who are better experts of the actual science, who can help us with evaluating a specific paper. At the same time, we treat reviewers as sort of advisors, not decision makers. So we never count their votes. We use our own brains and our own logic to think about each individual paper and what can be done, with the aim, and this is really important, to help you grow the paper, make the science stronger, make it better. And then it's sort of the paper cycles in between review and multiple revisions, with the hope that eventually it's going to be a much stronger piece of scientific literature. So as I said before, another part of what we do is related to writing. So this is a recent editorial from last month that I wrote. And because you're a community of scientists of science, this is sort of a report of a recent conference on science of science and innovation. That's from June. So we sort of go and talk about things that we think that community needs. We sort of suggest different directions where we feel like community should be heading, or perhaps something that is not ideal in that specific community. And we do that almost every month because there are several editors within the team of a specific journal. We sort of rotate and pick an editorial and a topic to write on almost every month. And then there's a part where authors really start disliking us, which is an actual editing. So this happens more often with opinion pieces, which you also publish, by the way, and less often with actual research papers. But this is what we call developmental editing, where we actually go in and kind of start nudging and helping the authors to better express themselves or express their ideas better. We act as sort of intermediaries between you as experts and our audience, which is generally quite broad, which means that sometimes the specialist language that specialists use, especially those specialists that are used to writing research papers only, that's not the best type of language to talk into non-specialist audiences. And so if I had to sort of summarize the relationship between us as editors of the journal and you as authors, that relationship is really complementary. So there are things that you as researchers, as scientists, are better at, and there are other things where perhaps we can help you, and we do help you. So you as authors have a really deep knowledge of a specific field or a specific topic in the field. So you know everything about, say, best methods in science of science, computational methods, machine learning methods, and so on. You know how to use them. You know what to do to sort of be efficient at using them, how to extract results, and so on. Whereas me as an editor, I wouldn't know all the details of that method. I would know sort of very broadly what are the methods, what are the strengths of methods, what are the weaknesses in the methods. But at the same time, I would know what are good methods in genetics, whereas perhaps to you as authors, that's a little bit irrelevant, but because I'm an editor who handles both genetics papers and economics papers and psychology papers and computational social science papers, I need to know sort of at a coarser grain the strengths and weaknesses in all of those fields. And as researchers, you also have research skills, whereas as editors, we sort of also know what are the basic principles in research, what are the best practices, but what we bring is our expertise in writing and language and sort of ways that we can help you in terms of expressing yourselves better. And last bit is that the last point is that you as authors are really aware of what's happening in your discipline. So this is also why we often go out and talk to you in conferences, and also by just calling you, by emailing you, following you on Twitter, because we really need to know what are the most important things happening in each discipline. And you're the best experts there. You know what are the most interesting research questions, what is missing, and what is going well as well. Whereas we have the knowledge of the market in general. So we sort of have a sense of what type of research is needed in terms of policy, what policymakers want, what type of research is going to be most impactful given that specific point in time and given all the events that happen in the world. And this is where, especially when it comes to magazine and opinion pieces, we sort of start talking to the community and nudging them towards perhaps looking into those specific questions, and then again coming back to us with results or articles or drafts. So these are three things that I always keep in mind when sort of I read your papers. So it's your intended audience, it's the story that you're telling, and it's the goals or sort of the impact that you want to make with that specific paper. And I also think that these are three things that determine the best journal for the paper. So by audience, I mean people who you think will read the paper once it's published. So if you aim for specialists, your colleagues studying the same research question in the same field, that's probably going to be your sort of intended destination is going to be a little bit different from the case where your audience would include policymakers or sort of general public. Same with the story. So if your research story is narrow, or if it makes an incremental advance in the field, if it's sort of preliminary, includes preliminary evidence, again, this is very different from a very complete story with a novel result, with a broad story, and with a strong base of evidence. And then with impacts and goals, if you're satisfying your own curiosity by publishing a paper, or if your goal is to publish a paper, again, that's going to be different than sort of aiming to solve a specific problem in societies or to inform policy. So based on those three variables, your paper would fall sort of anywhere within that spectrum between Nature, which is the broadest journal, which expects sort of the most general results, the strongest evidence, and the strongest impact in terms of societal issues. And on the other end of that spectrum, you would have scientific reports, which publishes even incremental results, sort of modifications of existing models, right? And the only criterion that they have is that the science there is valid, so that it sort of passes all those different stages of peer review, and that it sort of, the paper doesn't fall apart in peer review. So now I want to transition to the second part of a talk, where I sort of want to talk a bit more about sort of not what you write and how you select a destination and what we expect from you, but what makes a specific piece of academic or scientific writing readable versus unreadable. And the science writing in general is, I think nobody expects it to be readable at this point, because the expectation there is that people in science write mostly for their colleagues who have a specific style, who know what to expect, who are not afraid to read papers with complex sentences, about titles, with lots of passive voice and so on. And that sort of has become a norm in science publishing, right? But one reason for that is that in science, you sort of have to read papers. So there's not a choice. If you want to be up to date with what's going on in the field, you have to read papers. Now, when scientists start publishing opinion articles with us, that changes. And they kind of bring a lot of habits from academic writing. And because of that, we sort of have to work really hard with them to turn their opinion pieces into something that is much easier to read for somebody who's not in their field. And in general, if some of those lessons could translate to research writing as well, I really think that to sort of academic writing, I really think that things in academia could change in terms of readability. I really think that it could be much easier to read academic papers if some of those lessons could be learned from non-academic writing. So I want to start with probably the most important part of the article, given that you want your article to make some sort of impact and to be noticed. And that's a title. So this is something that probably 80% of authors get wrong. I don't know if we can have a poll in Zoom, but maybe you can just type in the chat. What do you think is the best out of these 5 titles, or your favorite, or the one that you would pick for your own research article? I'm gonna say my favorite.
They can type the answer in the chat. Yes.
4.
There you
I have
go.
a 4. I have another 4. One and 4. Wow. You're like long titles.
Arunas, I think we lost your camera or something.
Yeah, I think I got kicked out. Or yeah. I have another 2. Another 2. Somebody says 2 looks clickbaity. It does. Okay, I'm gonna stop here and I'm gonna move to the next slide. Instead of giving you
so Arunas, we
answer.
don't have you don't have your video on or something.
Really?
Yeah.
I see it
now.
Oh, you see him? Oh, I don't see him. Maybe it's me. Okay, never mind.
No, I see myself, so yeah. So but you can see my screen, right? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So instead of giving you the right answer, because there isn't a right answer, well, there sort of is, but maybe instead of that, I'll sort of tell you why that matters. So if you imagine that you're a journalist and you're looking for science stories to report on, several times a week you would get this press release email from us, from the whole set of journals. And that press release email would contain 2 parts. So in the first part, you would have a couple of articles that we decided, or our press office decided to highlight. And so you would have a title there, and you would have sort of an abstract-like description of the research, so that you could sort of skim for that and understand what the paper is on and why, we decided to highlight that paper. But then on the right-hand side of my screen, the rest of that email would only have 20 or 30 articles that are published on the same day, say, and a journalist would only see the titles there. And just based on those titles, and you know that journalists are really busy people, they would get those types of press release emails from many different companies, from publishers, governments, companies, and so on. So they're not gonna necessarily click on those titles and read your abstract. They have to decide if there's an interesting story in there worthy of reporting just based on the title. So if I sort of look into number 14, which says quantifying research waste in ecology, as a journalist, I would think, well, it's a paper in which scientists try to quantify research waste in ecology. Well, I kind of know what's it about, but I don't know what they actually find and whether it's interesting. So it's a little bit useless. But then if I look at the title number 14, aging red deer alter their spatial behavior and become less social, that's really informative. It's not long, but it tells me that the paper is on aging red deer, and that the main result is that once they reach a certain age, they become less social. So if I'm writing for a, moose and deer magazine, that's going to be a really that's just going to be informative enough for me to click on the title and read more, because I would know that perhaps this is going to be interesting for my audience. So now going back to our little quiz, yes, I agree. Number 2 really sounds clickbaity. Can computer think like a baby? What does it tell us? Well, we know the answer, it can't, right? We don't really know what people did in the paper, what they found, what is the result, and even what is the general field of research. So if I didn't know the paper, that would be pretty much useless. Same with number 3, human behavior and wildfire smoke. Well, it's about human behavior and about wildfire smoke, but what does it do? What does it find? I don't know. The title doesn't say. I really liked the answers 1 and 4. They are not too long. They don't tell us too much in terms of detail, but they're so informative. So number 1 tells us that the paper is about misinformation and trying to reduce it, and that the main finding is that modest interventions can actually help. Same with number 4. It's about recognizing speech, and the main result is that human neonates learn to recognize it on the first day of life. So I hope that is helpful. I'm going to move now to some of the other common issues that we see in both in research papers and in opinion articles. This is an excerpt from a book called The Elements of Style, which is probably required reading in every school of journalism still to this day. And so it says that the secret of good writing is to strip every sentence to its cleanest components, that complex sentences make the reader do the work instead of saying what an author intends to say. So this is sort of a typical sentence that the authors sort of like to have in their papers, especially research papers. Knowledge production is overwhelmingly skewed towards resource-wealthy countries such as this and that house the best universities, Nobel winners, journal editors. So identifying undercited countries both promotes the inclusion and helps foster the scientific enterprises of these countries. So if your mind is busy, if you wake up early in the morning, by the end of a sentence, you might still remember the beginning of a sentence. But if your mind is busy and if you read a lot, you're just not going to remember what the sentence is about. And any editor would kind of take that sentence, would read it once, and then would split it into 3 different simple sentences, so that human mind could actually keep up with the voice of the author, so that the mind would not forget the beginning of the sentence once you reach the end. This is another example. A lack of data on behaviors and exposures makes the evaluation of existing policy approaches challenging, which is particularly problematic for the large number of environmental settings in which current policy largely relies on individuals to protect themselves. Just to read it, I ran out of breath. And there's a sentence, there's a main sentence, and there's another sentence embedded within it. There's a number thought at that 3rd level, and so on. So even though this is common, it's not It doesn't have to be that way. Splitting sentences whenever they are too long, whenever you can't read them out loud without losing breath. Another really common issue, lots of needless words that don't really add any value to an essay or to a research paper. And this is so common in academic writing. Just a little fact that most drafts, especially of opinion articles, can be essentially cut in half without any loss in terms of meaning, in terms of the amount of useful information that the author wants to convey. So a few examples. Global warming will allow disproportionately more rainfall to accumulate during single precipitation events. Disproportionately more rainfall to accumulate and precipitation events. So a person is sort of talking about storms and about more rain falling. So why not more rain will fall during storms thanks to global warming? The social sciences are strongly consumed in government and media documents while showing systematically low usage in patents, showing low usage. Why do we need to sort of show usage instead of documents being used less? So there's an additional word that doesn't really say anything. And then this is, some authors really like this one. It should be noted that, and then they tell an important thing, or it is important to note that something. If it's really important to note, then just note it. The reader will recognize that it's an important fact. And then things like due to the fact that, and so on, or we lack the ability to. It sounds formal, and this is why researchers really like, academics in general really like using those types of sentences. But those 4 or 5 words can actually be expressed in one, because, or we cannot. And there's really no reason to believe that you will sound more amateur or less professional. You will just sound better and more readable. So this is also a really common one. People use overly general language in papers, and they expect that the reader will somehow, from the context, will infer the specifics. But the human brain normally doesn't work in generalities. We need examples, we need specifics. So things like, it is well known that people desire mates that are similar to themselves. This is literally the first sentence of an abstract. Well, who knows that? Why, sort of, where does this come from? Who said that? I don't know. It's very general. It doesn't sound strong in terms of evidence. With a possible exception of, what does a possible exception mean? It's very vague, very general. So is there an exception or not? Or maybe there's an exception in the real world, but in your work there was not an exception. Maybe they're the other way around. And then words like can, contribute, might, propagate, they don't really say anything. They're not specific. They're sort of hedge words, which sort of make the sentence sound weak. This last one is kind of probably my favorite, with significant contributions to exposure, adverse health effects from rural residential emissions are inevitable. Adverse health effects, it's really general. What is that? Is that an injury of some sort? So have you seen a warning sign like that says shallow water, and if you dive, there's going to be adverse health effects in your body somewhere? Probably not, because that would be a very ineffective communication of the whole situation there. Instead, it says shallow water, diving could result in injury or death. So by adverse health effects, it would mean that you're going to die. So be specific, and it's going to be much easier for the reader to understand. And also, their mind is not going to be occupied trying to figure out what you actually mean. You're not going to sound less professional. Overstatements, this is something that we see very often, especially in cover letters. So I didn't mention this, but when the article comes to us, there's a cover letter, like a letter to the editor, that summarizes what the article is about and why we should be interested in it. And very often it contains gems like our groundbreaking model, or this novel finding overturns this and that, or we had an unprecedentedly large data set. So if you just do that once, it's okay. We kind of understand that you're proud of your work, but if you sort of keep repeating that, it becomes a little bit suspicious. It's clear that you're overstating, and it's also clear that it's a sort of self-promotion. So instead of saying that something is important or groundbreaking, sort of show us, tell us what you do and how it's different from what's been done before. And then we're going to trust in you, and the reader is going to trust in you. Because overstatements just promote mistrust, really. And it's not unique to academic or science writing. It's also, it applies to news and essays and so on. Another thing that the authors probably think makes them sound more professional is passive voice. And they also dislike verbs for some reason, whereas verbs actually do all the important work in sentences. So data were collected in several communities along the river. Data were collected. That's passive. That doesn't sound strong. Again, human mind tends to think about stories, about sort of any type of a written piece of nonfiction in terms of who is doing what. So if there is not a subject, nobody who's doing the action, it makes it very easy for you to lose the reader. And same happens when you turn your verbs, so words that actually make a person do something, into nouns. So observed decreasing trends in the vulnerability to floods and droughts owing to effective risk management. Something's doing something, but we don't really know what is being done. There's not a verb in that red part anywhere. There's only nouns. And so it's really difficult to actually assign different actions to different people. So why not say we observe trends that are decreasing, and they are because of this and that. Just last 4 tips. There are many more, but we probably need a whole series of lectures to cover all of that, and I'm sure there are people who are more qualified to talk about writing in general than me. Academic publishing, at least in my view, is so unreadable because you sort of learn from examples. So if you're a junior researcher, you learn from reading manuscripts from your supervisors and other people working in the field. If they write in passive voice, if they write in generalities and complex sentences, you're going to copy that. But instead, and maybe this is also a question that you can answer in the chat, sort of think about who your favorite science writers are and why it is easy to read them, and try imitating them instead of the status quo in academic publishing. The second point, or a tip, is that you don't have to simplify your stories. Your research story is a complex story, and you can still tell it, but just don't tell it in a complex language. So there is a difference between complexity of the story and complexity of your sentences. And as long as you're being slow, you're taking the reader with you. If you're not sort of repeating some of those 6 mistakes or issues that we talked about before, you're going to be fine, and the reader is going to be fine. The third one, this is especially relevant to those of you who struggle to finish perhaps their thesis or perhaps their articles, because you kind of feel like they're not coming out as good as you hoped the first time. So what you need to do, and that's how all writing works, is that you just need to finish your first draft and not care about typos, not care about structure, not care about anything, knowing that it's far from the final product, that you're going to rewrite it 20 times. And the real writing begins when you start your writing. And the fourth, and probably the best one, is reading your writing out loud. So you're going to notice that if you run out of breath, your sentences are too complex. You will notice that you have too many unnecessary words because you keep repeating yourself. And you will notice that your structure just doesn't work because there are gaps in your story. And just some resources if you're sort of interested in learning more. So one book that I mentioned already, The Elements of Style, it's really short and you can find that online, I think, even for free. It's really a sort of, just has 20 or so rules that sort of are easy to memorize, and they apply to all sorts of writing. Not just academic writing, but nonfiction in general. The second one, on writing well, this is a bit broader, a bit more detailed, but also extremely useful. So if you like the elements of style, you can sort of transition to that one. And again, a lot of it is not going to be relevant to academic writing, but at least half of it will be. And the third one, so this is something that those of you who submitted their writing samples to the Google Drive folder already know about, because I left some comments there. This is an app, and let me see if I can switch to that. So it's called Hemingway Editor, and what it does is it highlights overly complex sentences in red. It highlights things like passive voice. It highlights adverbs that are not necessary. And in general, it kind of gives you a readability score and sort of tries to nudge you towards writing in more simple sentences. So it's not going to fix all of your issues. It's not magic. You still have to sort of be confident into your own skills and what you're trying to say, but it's going to nudge you towards noticing more just how bad and how complex writing can sometimes get without you even noticing. I'm going to go back to the slides now. And so with that, again, I want to thank Daniel for inviting me. The summer school is really a great idea, and it's so good to see so many people actually being interested in it. And in our mentoring sessions a little bit later today and tomorrow, what we can do is we can go through your writing samples that you submitted. We can try editing them together. We can talk a little bit more about sort of publishing or selecting a journal or suggesting reviewers or writing an appeal letter, really anything that you want that has to do with behind the scenes action within the journal. But we can also talk about other things, like perhaps you want to become an editor one day. So we can talk about editorial careers. We can talk about science writing careers and anything else. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Arunas. Let's give him a round of virtual applause through the buttons here on Zoom. I'm going to remove the pin. So thank you. So if there are questions, please unmute yourself and ask them away.
It's the best when there are no questions. I just know that. Yeah. I just know that, you know.
You're so clear with your presentation. Your embrace that there are no doubts. Okay, there are questions in the chat, so if you can read them, or I can read them for you. But
oh yeah, okay. I didn't have my chat open. So I really like when people actually ask the questions themselves because it feels more personal.
Yes.
So if there are any questions after these, just raise your hand or whatever. But Eric, do you recommend using first person or avoiding it instead of data were collected is we collected data acceptable? It was always tough to avoid first person resorting to the author in emergencies. We collected data is perfectly fine. So you are the subject or your lab is a subject. So, you know, the reader will know who is doing the action. Data were collected, yeah, just don't do that. It's a passive voice. It's not clear who's doing the action. It sounds impersonal. It's much harder to follow. One slide back, please. Here we go. Thanks. Any tips for a writer's block? Yeah, it's sort of, I don't know anybody has sort of a solution to a writer's block, as writer's block happens for different people for different reasons. But I think one of those 4 tips at the end really applies there. So if you cannot write, because you sort of are afraid that your final product is not going to be perfect, just write anything and then shape it into a better shape. If you're writing sort of more of a, I don't really know if you're asking about fiction or nonfiction. If you're writing fiction, then that's not going to help, of course, because it's probably a creativity issue. So maybe a walk or a good night's sleep. But in my experience, and I still remember myself writing my thesis or my first papers, the best solution would always be just to write the first draft without really caring about anybody seeing it, just for yourself, knowing that you will rewrite it many, many times. How do you assess whether something has market awareness, how to increase it for ourselves? So by market awareness, perhaps I meant something a little bit different than sort of what is meant typically by market awareness in business. So for example, as a journal, we also publish psychology papers, we publish neuroscience papers and so on. And so pieces and pitches that came into us after the war in Ukraine started, those were really valuable, that focused on, for instance, psychological effects of trauma and so on. So the authors there were aware that this thing is happening in the world. Other papers on mobility of refugees and so on, sort of computational analysis of mobility data, focusing on what is going on in the world right now. So it shows us that the author sort of thinks about what's going to have value in the world, that's going to be valuable to economists and policymakers. Yeah, that would be the answer. And how to increase it for ourselves. So it's difficult if you're more of a junior researcher, unless you're in the lab where you're free to do whatever you want, choose your own research project. So I would say read a lot outside of your main research field. Perhaps even fields that you're not that familiar with, psychology, economics. You might notice something, a bit of knowledge that you have that you might be able to apply there. Especially if you think that a research question that you're working on right now doesn't really have that immediate sort of impact in terms of what the world needs now. So sort of try expanding your network of publications that you read. The question on everyone's minds, when you receive an article for editorial consideration, what are the first 3 things you look at before deciding whether or not to send it to review? So it's not actually a secret. We had an editorial at NHB kind of outlining our sort of a criteria that we'll look into when deciding sort of whether the article is going to be a good fit for us or not. I can try digging that link out. But to summarize briefly, there are things like the scale of advance compared to the state of the art in the field. So whether you're making an incremental modification to a model and find a slightly different result, that's probably going to be a scientific reports paper. But if you're coming up with your own model that is widely applicable, that is general, that's going to be a paper for us. The strength of evidence. So say an example from Science of Science, if you're trying to answer a specific question and analyze data from a single publisher or a single journal, that's going to be a weak evidence in support of that specific finding that you have. But if you instead analyze the biggest available data set that covers multiple publishers, multiple journals in different disciplines and so on, and still find the same result. But it's going to show us that the evidence for your findings is really strong. Then, of course, the importance of a research question and the breadth of your how broad is sort of the intended audience. So if your research question addresses something that's important to one narrow field, say, you know, a specific set of mobility models, and only your colleagues at the same university and 100 other people in the world are working on the same question, that's again a scientific reports paper. But if it's an interdisciplinary work, if you're working on, say, addressing inequalities in publishing, so that's sort of an important question in sociology, right? Because sociologists think about that. It's an important question perhaps to economists and psychologists and scientists of science and computational social scientists. It's an important question to policymakers who are trying to implement policies that would reduce inequities. That's going to be a paper for us. So those main three things, and once I find the link to the editorial, I'll share that as well.
Arunas, sorry to interrupt, but we're a little over. So let's stop here. If you have time, you can answer them on the chat. But during the mentorship session, I'm sure people will have tons of questions. Let's thank Arunas for his time and his great tips.